I'm happy to be doing a lecture in honor of Thomas Buford Maston. As David said, I got to know him in the last few years of his life. I came to Southwestern as a assistant professor in New Testament and Greek, and it happened that Dr. Maston, who held 2 PhDs, had never taken Greek or Hebrew, and it bothered him his whole life. He didn't have anybody to talk to him about Hebrew words, but he found me to talk about Greek words. And that happened through my being his preacher for several years. He would use me as a consultant to figure out the ins and outs of certain interpretations. And he was working on his last manuscript during those days when he found out that a group of robbers from another university had come to Southwestern and offered me a contract to go to their faculty. And he wrote me a 2-page letter, a typed letter, on his old typewriter. It's one of those where some of the keys don't quite make the letters. And in it he described how you make decisions of the heart. And he cited a tradition handed down to him by Jeff Ray, a preaching professor at Southwestern, of what B.H. Carroll, the president of the seminary, had told him. And then he recited for me a personal experience he had with L.R. Scarborough, the second president of Southwestern. And then he laid this advice on me. It's pretty simple, but it was very impressive to me. He said, Bruce, if God has called you to a place, then you should never leave unless God calls you to leave. Not that you know another place that's better, but it's incumbent upon you to hear the will of the Lord before you make a decision of the heart. That's what I did. I stayed, and in 2 years, I ran across Linda Ray. So that was a very important time in my own life, and it reflects a lot of what Dr. Maston was about. He believed that the Christian faith rested deep in the inner person, and that convictions must arise from there about life choices. So I've decided to give you a lecture entitled Decisions of the Heart. A part of it is out of the Scripture. A good part of it is out of my own experience. I've now reached the ripe age of 75, so I'm reverting to my days in college. I started in college in 1960, and it was in that year that I made the decision that has impacted my life the most. So I want to try to touch you where you are right now rather than giving you an old folks story. I have a journal entry before me dated September 30th, 1659. It reads, I, poor, miserable Robinson Crusoe, being shipwrecked during a dreadful storm, in the offing came on shore at this dismal, unfortunate island, which I call the Island of Despair, all the rest of the ship's company being drowned, and myself almost dead. Defoe's hero came ashore, saved out of the storm. He thanks God for his health, but very quickly he wishes that he were dead. Sounds like the story of some freshman I know. Another journal entry dates from the early spring, probably of AD 60. It reads, "And thus we came to Rome, and the brethren, when they heard about us, came from there as far as the market of Appius and the Three Inns to meet us. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage." Luke's hero, Acts 28, thanked God when he saw a place. He had been saved alive out of a storm, and now perhaps forlorn, but a traveler stationed south of Rome. He has not been washed up in the backside of God's will. This place is a reason for rejoicing. It is the end of a journey long intended and long cherished in his heart. It falls in a map in Paul's life that is traced over in the will of God. His thanksgiving is not misplaced. Rome, the eternal city, was the target of God's purpose for Paul, and it is that which causes him to give thanks and not to despair. The ending of the book of Acts with Paul in Rome raises a lot of questions. Two of them are, how did he get there? And what is it that led him to have such courage? These questions come up in all of our pilgrimage. And the advantage of reading the book of Acts with hindsight is we can learn from it. In fact, the way to start is with the ending and then to backtrack. In chapters 26 and 27 of Acts, Paul is shipwrecked in the Mediterranean, a voyage undertaken against his will, but in the will of God, to be heard before the Caesar. Chapters 24 and 25, there are 2 years of imprisonment, where he awaits a hearing from a Roman governor. In chapters 22 and 23, there is an arrest in Jerusalem. Paul is saved from a lynch mob by a Roman commander. In chapters 20 and 21, he comes to Jerusalem with a collection of money, along with delegates from churches in the eastern provinces, to visit the mother church. Embedded in this last narrative, there is a decision of the heart. Chapter 21, verses 10 through 14. After a number of days, Luke says, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles." When we heard this, we and the people there pleaded with Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. And then Paul answered, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, "The Lord's will be done." After this, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. This is a climactic episode in Paul's decision-making. It crystallized a decision that he had made very early in the Ephesian ministry, where he announced that he would go to Rome by going east, by going to Jerusalem. As he progressed to Jerusalem, churches throughout the Aegean tell him goodbye in tears and grieving. And now he comes to Philip's home in Caesarea. And there again he is greeted by friends and a strange prophet who in Old Testament style makes a symbolic act by taking Paul's belt and tying himself up, then saying that Paul, the owner, will be bound in Jerusalem. Paul had foreboding of such things, but he did not know exactly what would happen to him. When they saw Agabus, everyone there took it as a pronouncement of the Holy Spirit. The 4 daughters, perhaps, who were prophetesses, the neighbors, the believers who were supporters of Paul, all began to rail against his intention, actually breaking his heart in pieces. And the last phrase is the important one. They concede that the will of the Lord should be done. I think it is a counsel of despair, and it feeds on an assumption that the will of God is a full roadmap handed down out of heaven in which all your future is laid out. In fact, it's not so for any of us, and it was not so for Paul. He did not know everything. The important intentions that lie in the decision of one's heart are also fleshed out in the doing of God's will. Doors open, doors close, and you may not know the path until you get there. It's difficult to say yes to what you believe to be the will of God when all of the feedback around you says no. But there are some earmarks of a heart decision that is the will of God. And let me unpack a couple of these. One is, along the way, God confirms your journey. The will of God is never spoken just once. It is repeated time and again. And in Paul's story in the last half of the book of Acts, there are 6 episodes where the Lord speaks to him, intervening in a circumstance. And each time, once again, the will of God is reinforced. You know the beginning at Damascus. The Lord speaks to him on the road. He also speaks to a believer in the city itself, Ananias, who comes to help Paul understand what has happened to him. Then he goes to Jerusalem, and he tells us that while he was there, the Lord spoke to him in the temple. Apparently he had gone there to worship. And the Lord reconfirms what had happened to him 3 years earlier. He goes on a trip into the boondocks for 10 years. And God sends a man named Barnabas to recall him into the work of ministry. And in the city of Corinth, he's fallen into difficulty with the legal authorities. And again, the Lord speaks to him and tells him that he will be able to handle his difficulties. He had come into Greece by a vision while he was in the west of Asia. And in that vision, a Macedonian speaks to him, asking him to come over. When he goes to Jerusalem for the last time, he is jailed. And in the jail, there is a plot against him by Jewish partisans. His nephew learns about it and comes and tells him. Now, Paul had had a vision while he was in the jail. The Lord had told him it's going to be all right. He didn't tell him it was going to be all right because of the nephew. He just told him he would take care of him. And Paul was wise enough to have the counsel of the nephew go to the commander and ask for him to be relieved of Jerusalem custody. He's taken to Caesarea. He goes on this fateful boat trip. It was his way to go to Rome. Did he know that he would take this trip when he was in the city of Corinth or in Asia? No. It now becomes an open door to him. And of course, the boat trip itself is a disaster. And on the ship, Paul once again is visited by the Lord. And he is told, stay here, you must go to Rome. But also, he is told, this ship must run aground. Now, did he know he was going to go into the Italian peninsula on a piece of driftwood when God called him on the Damascus Road? No, he only knew because God confirmed it in the journey. God does not speak one time in your life. He speaks over and over. And if you've made a decision of the heart, that is the will of God, He will confirm it to you. My first college job was as a janitor. That's the way I earned my tuition. You say, what was your tuition? 1960, it was $1.75 a credit hour. I know, it's a sad thing. As janitor, I cleaned up the education building, a 3-story building. It was across from the dormitories, so my roommate could see me in the building. The light would come on the first floor. I'd go in a room, do it, turn the light off, and go on all through the building. So he followed my progress about 2 hours each evening. I was something like a rat in a maze. I knew this pattern very carefully. And it was a pattern of going to an open door, turning on a light, darkening the room behind me, and finishing this process. So I had this idea of open door. It was sort of in my mind. During those days, I was struggling with a very difficult decision. My father was not a Christian. I was the first person in our family to go to college. He had designs on what I should be. The Lord had a different design. I knew that I should go into the preaching ministry. And I knew at a point in time I was going to have to make that decision public and make it known to my father. So that evening, I went to my dorm room. I leaned down to open the door with my key, and my key was around my neck on a chain. And when I reached down, the chain broke. So I held the key in my hand. And I went into the room, distraught, worrying about what I was going to do. I threw my key down on the pillow on my bed and fell down on the bed, looked at the key. And the key had 1, 10, and 32, 3 numbers. So what I did was this. I looked in the first book of the New Testament, the 10th chapter, and began reading at verse 32. Now, before I tell you this, I want to enter a warning. This is called biblical bingo. The practice of sortilege, the Greek or the Latin sortis, word for casting lots, was well known in the early church, even up through the 4th and 5th centuries. In fact, the Wesleyans practiced it regularly. Taking a Bible, opening it up, putting your finger down on a verse to soothsay your future. Now, you heard about the guy who was in terrible business distress. His company was in financial ruin. So he decided to find his fortune by opening up the Bible and putting his finger on the verse that he saw. And he looked up and he saw chapter 11. That'll have to sink in a little while. You're not always going to find the will of God by flipping open a Bible and putting your finger on a verse. In fact, the practice is forbidden in the church, has been for years. But I am one example. By the way, there are others, Augustine, other people, the Lord has confirmed something to by this means. I'm just not recommending it to you. At verse 32 of Matthew, Jesus speaks to his disciples, and in the next 5 verses, he twice says something which struck very close to me. He who loves father or mother, but father's the one that stuck with me. He who loves father more than me is not worthy of me. And that verse made my decision. I told my father what I must do. He didn't accept it. He did not approve of it. And it was almost an entire generation before he came to approve of what I was doing. By the way, his story ended well. He did become a Christian, but in his dying days. I would never have made my decision unless I had made a decision of the heart, and God confirming my decision along the way. A second thing, emotional hardships do not control your decision making. Paul is the Energizer bunny. He just kept on going. In his ministry, the cities, Damascus, Jerusalem, Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, Caesarea, Rome. Trouble in every city. He had a rap sheet as long as my arm. No search committee would ever have looked at him because he had been indicted too many times. And he tells us, 3 times I was shipwrecked for a night and day. I was adrift at sea on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And apart from unmentioned trouble, he says, there was the daily burden upon me of the care of the churches. This is a man who knew hard work, imprisonments, beatings, time without number, often near death. 5 times his Jewish compatriots administered 39 lashes to his body. 3 times Roman lictors beat him with rods. Once he was stoned and left for dead, dragged out to the city limits and dumped like trash. You can take him at his word when he says that his outer man was perishing. But he said that this works in him a weight of glory which outweighs all of the trouble. The word that he uses to describe putting on the weight of heaven is the word varos, from which we get barometer, It is the idea of the feeling of weight from the atmosphere, is the way we use it. It also translates the Old Testament word kavod, which also means heavy. And that is the word glory in the Old Testament. When the Lord appears to Israel, it is his kavod, the heaviness that surrounds them. His presence is an enveloping cloud of weight and gets their attention and keeps their focus. Paul, instead of being broken by hardship, understood the weight of glory in his life, and it outweighs everything else. The worst thing that you can ever do is to ask God to tell you everything. He protects us by letting us know only when we need to know. So the will of God is a knowledge not only of good things, but of also how you handle bad things. I don't know how many times in my life I could recount in which I could have cashed in my chips, pulled the plug, and said, I've had enough. But that never entered my mind. And I also think that the worst thing you can do is make a decision because of your emotional hardships. That's not the time to do it. The Lord bears with you and helps you in the most difficult of circumstances. And sometimes it comes as a bend in the road that you never expected. But it's the common lot of all people. There's nothing that has happened to you that doesn't happen to everybody else. But in the midst of a hardship, God will make a way that you can cope with it. Now, that passage in 1 Corinthians 10 is often quoted to mean that God will take you on a detour around any trouble. That is not what it says. What it says is the Lord will make a way that you can go through it, that you can handle it. And when you make an important decision, don't make it based on your emotions. And that's where the word heart on our tongues is a little different than heart in the Bible. Did you know that the closest interchange to the word heart in Paul is the word mind? And we would never say, I love you with all my mind. If you say that to your boyfriend or girlfriend, they're looking for another word. I love you with all my heart. But in fact, the heart is not the base of emotion. It is the base of decision, of dedication. And that is the way you are supposed to look at things, with the mind. So a Christian makes a decisive dedication, a sacrifice to the Lord. And you don't let the world squeeze you into its mold, but you are transformed by the Spirit of God who renews your mind, that you may test, that you may examine and actually prove that God's will is the perfect thing for you. The will of God is not an escape from emotional hardships. It happens in the midst of them. Also, and I think most importantly, the decision of the heart is conviction. And the Conviction can be said in two simple words. I must. The conviction I must becomes the basis, the reason for your life direction. This is the must of God's will. In the book of Acts, there's a little word that is used 22 times. It is an impersonal verb from the word which means to tie up, to bind, what Agabus did with the belt. And it is often described as divine necessity. When it is used of Paul, it is usually translated must. For example, in Acts 19:21, Paul says that he is finished with Jerusalem. After there, I must also see Rome. In Acts 23, he is told to be of good courage. You have witnessed in Jerusalem. You must also bear witness at Rome. In Acts 27, on the boat, the Lord tells him to not be afraid. You must stand before Caesar. The divine die. I must do this. It's not a gut feeling. It is a conviction that God has put in your heart. It is a reason for why you really do things. Pascal said that the heart has its reasons that reason knows nothing of. It comes from a trained heart in obeying the will of God. That whatever happens, there is a must in your life. There's a story told often about Sir Christopher Wren and the design of a building. The story is often told about a building in London or a building in Oxford. In fact, none of those are correct. It is the Guildhall in Windsor. Wren was a citizen of the city of Windsor. And in 1687, the city undertook to build a Guildhall for the city council to meet. Wren was not the first architect, but the man who began the building died, and the city fathers consulted Wren, who was busy building 51 churches in London, Oxford, and everywhere all over England. And they brought Wren into the building and told him that it appeared that the ceiling arches were not supported well, and that they wanted 4 columns put in the center of the building to support it. Wren looked at the building and decided, we don't need any columns. It stands as it is. And they insisted. So he put up the 4 columns. Thing is, when he finished them, the top of the column was 1 inch below the ceiling. It did not touch it. And the ceiling stands 300 years later. You can go online and Google a picture of the gap between Wren's columns and that ceiling. What was it that made Wren take such a plan? Well, it wasn't stubbornness. It was his conviction that he knew what he was doing. And he did. You must have a foundation in your life that is a guiding conviction. And it is the must of the will of God. I'm not referring to being just a preacher or dedicating yourself to religious work. I'm talking about all of us. The call of God is for every person who is a Christian. We are all to have a once-upon-a-lifetime dedication to Him that becomes the must in our lives. That is what happened in my life. And when I made my decision to enter the ministry, I made a public commitment. A group of preachers got together and ordained me and gave me a sheet of paper which said that I had been ordained to the gospel ministry. Well, I thought I knew what that was, and through life I've discovered I didn't know what that was. I began as a youth minister, then I was a pastor, then I became a college teacher, then a seminary teacher, and then, God forbid, an administrator. And then I became a president. Along the way, I was made a deacon, and now I am retired. So it wasn't a vocational identity that I took up. It was a must deeply embedded in my heart that it is God's will that I work in Christian ministry. And that's the way it's happened. Did I know any of these things when I started? No. Did I know all of them along the way? No. The unfolding of the will of God is always underwritten with a must. I've been impressed with the number of Baptists who have followed such a course. Linda and I have visited the roots of Baptist missions in East Anglia in the hometowns of Andrew Fuller, John Ryland, William Carey. We have at Carroll Institute a bench from William Carey's church at Moton in England. So Carey's story has reverberated through my mind a lot of times. The night of decision was October the 2nd, 1792. They met in Kettering in the home of Mrs. Wallace, which was called the Gospel Inn because she fed so many preachers. William Cooper describes the night as a bad night, succeeded by an east wind. The sky was all full of sables. It was the approach of winter, and it had a melancholy effect. But that evening, a group of young preachers took up a promissory offering of 13 shillings, put it in Andrew Fuller's snuff box, and appointed a cobbler to be their emissary to go to the Dark Continent. And his name was William Carey. They gave their movement a name, the Particular Baptist Society for Propagating the Gospel Among the Heathen. And the name did not kill the movement. Very few people endorsed Carey's opinion. Chief among them, his father and also his wife. And there's come down to us a letter which he wrote to his father. This is what he said. Dear and honored Father, the importance of spending our time for God alone is the principal theme of the gospel. I beseech you, says Paul, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. To be devoted like a sacrifice to holy uses is the great business of a Christian. I hope, dear Father, you may be able to surrender me up to the Lord for the most arduous, honorable, and important task that ever any of the sons of men were called to engage in. I have many sacrifices to make. I have set my hand to the plow. 41 years he stayed in India with the loss of family, only to return at the very end of his life. He is the father of the modern mission movement. A decision of the heart. God took a shoe cobbler from Moton to be his agent. It teaches us that God's wisdom is richly intended for the plain man or woman. The plainest of lives has the richest of intention in God's will. A poem I have embroidered is in our library, and it's a portrayal of much of my life. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I observed a good while ago that Baptist preachers have stopped issuing calls to young Christian people to make a decision of the heart to do the will of God. When I was your age, it was common that college students walked aisles, dedicated themselves to do the will of God. That's the most important decision of your heart that you will ever make. I hope you make it today.